Chapter 28 Bibliothèque Nationale de France, Paris, France, June 14th, 1889. It had been several years since Will had last been to Paris. It was one of the first places he had visited as a young man, and subsequently it was also one of the few places he had adventured without some form of guide. He now began to wonder how much of the country he had truly missed on his last stay. Not everywhere needed a guide, of course. Most environments he was familiar enough with, and he could handle himself quite easily within them. Others were more complicated, however. Tundras, jungles, deserts. His mind slipped momentarily to a memory of his time in America. The Pacific Railroad had been built long before his arrival, he was sure of it, and yet he had found himself forgoing it for a traversal across the continent on horseback. He might not have been alive today, were it not for his guide at the time, who had found Will fevered and near death at the hands of some unclean river water. He wondered vaguely what had become of that guide, whether he was still moving town to town, keeping himself busy, or if he had finally settled down. Will had considered on his journey across the English Channel whether or not he should find a local guide in France. There was no point now, of course. He had been in France over a week, and the time had passed around him at an alarming rate. He wasn't losing time, exactly. It was more that he was thrown into an inconsistent cycle of uneasy sleep, which had severed his connection to the passage of time as it moved around him. He would wake thinking it to be morning and find it was in fact late in the evening. Other times Will would find himself unable to sleep at all, so overcome with nausea that he could scarcely move from his bed regardless. He had dreamt in his pained sleep. He had dreamt when he was awake, too, unable to tell the difference between the real world and the visions opposed upon it. It was always of the being in the alley, the thing that was not sherbet. Will didn't know what happened in those dreams. Those details always seemed to escape him. He just knew that the entity was there. Will wasn't sure how much time he had wasted recovering from his bout of madness by the time he finally found himself traversing the Paris streets in a dreary, tired state. Part of him, the quieter part of his mind still subdued by the fogginess of a heavy head cold, longed to go back to England, to monitor the condition of Ray and make sure his friend was all right, to help the others at the Fable Society in any way he could. This urge was drowned out, however, by the louder, driving part of his brain which pushed him forward now. The voice in his mind, which he felt increasingly seemed different to his own, that pushed him towards a newfound goal. The text, Will thought hazily. Or if Will did not think it, something else thought it for him. Around him the summer sun baked the muck-covered streets to clay, filling the air with an oppressive smell not dissimilar to that of London's own, and still entirely unpleasant. Will rounded a corner and now stared up at a towering building, squinting against the sun at the yellow stone, washed white in the cloudless light of day. The cartographer blinked his tired eyes at the facade. His stomach lurched in the way it had in the alley, and he was reminded of the books flying from their shelves in the British Museum. The feeling of that sinking pit of dread, and the knowledge of that presence behind him. Will shivered as if he could dry himself at the feeling like a dog might shed water from its coat. He took a deep breath of the putrid air and walked up the front stairs of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Wilton was right to guide him here, even if the journey had taken him longer than he expected. The building housed, as the sour-faced archivist later told him, the largest collection of books and written manuscripts in the world. If anything held the key to deciphering this strange language, it would be here, within these halls. Will sucked in a breath at the sight which met him beyond the entryway. A sprawling, open room stretched out before him, bookshelves lining the circular walls. High overhead, an intricate domed ceiling of glass flooded the vast space with sunlight, its reflections catching on the metallic edges of desks and the glass cases around empty lanterns, scattering brilliant, heavenly beams of light around the room. He stood in awe for a while, before that louder voice. It did seem different to his own, now that his senses seemed more alert. louder and more echoing, urged him forwards. Wilton had been kind enough, it seemed, to warn his contacts at the library of Will's oncoming arrival, and the librarian who presided over the manuscript wing was surprised to see him arrive so late. After a few conversations which rather abruptly re-established Will's relationship with the French language, the explorer found himself in the cavernous interior of the library, being led through darkened passages and brilliantly lit rooms, casting glances into ornament-filled glass cases and peering around towering columns. Here, his guide stopped suddenly, and Will caught himself before he barreled into the woman. His halt was abrupt, more like someone had grabbed him by the collar than like he had stopped moving of his own accord, yet glancing around, Will saw no one else who could have done such a thing. The archivist gestured to a large wooden desk in the corner of the room. A series of leather tubes and glass cases had been arrayed around its edges, as had a pair of gloves, along with various archival tools which were arrayed across its surface. The shorter woman continued in heavily accented English for Will's benefit. Our colleagues have found all remnants of the language you required, as requested by Professor Jensen, for your benefit. Thank you, Will nodded, casting another furtive glance over his shoulder before moving to sit down behind the desk. We have found some notes of previously translated attempts. The guide nodded at a folder on the table. Stray pages threatened to spill out onto the floor. Should you require assistance, our staff are around as needed. She eyed his haggard and unshaven face suspiciously with her cold blue eyes before leaving him alone. Wonderful, Will muttered to himself. Swinging his pack from his shoulder, Will took out his notebook, the strange letter folded up inside it. As he did so, he caught his reflection in the glass of an unlit lantern. His face was worn and tired, his dark hair a tangled mess. Will had looked disheveled before. He had travelled to the far corners of the earth, spent months in the heart of jungles or floating aimlessly along rivers in hand-built rafts. But never before did he look as wild as he did now, as obsessed and frantic as when he began poring over the tattered remnants of scrolls, fragmentary pieces of worn-away paper, and shattered segments of clay and stone. As obsessed and frantic as when he began poring over the tattered remains of scrolls, fragmentary pieces of worn-away paper, the shattered segments of clay and stone, and charcoal rubbings of stone facades, the originals too large to be housed in any archive. The soft white cotton gloves felt strange against his scarred and calloused hands. His fingers traced gently over the markings on the pages, and his eyes flitted between the ancient texts and the attempted translations by those who had come before him. He switched to his own notes, his rudimentary attempts, and his eyes caught something on the letter itself. The letter was not long, comprised of only a few lines, arranged in a way which reminded him almost of poetry. Will had read the letter countless times already. He knew the words, if not their meanings. He was sure he did. This letter had been eating away at him for days, tearing down his sanity word by word, letter by letter. He had carved these words into the cliff face of his mind where they would remain forever, and yet, now they were different. The handwriting was the same, that almost childlike scrawl, and the language was still the same. Yet the words had changed. Will blinked rapidly at the page as if it was merely a trick of his own tired eyes, and it would return to its older form soon enough. The sun had begun to set outside, and orange and pink rays streamed in through the large windows above him. Questioning if it was a trick of the dying light, Will pulled the letter closer, holding it up to his eyes. The words were still different. The message had changed. There had been no point at which the letter had not been on his person, no chance for it to have been switched or replaced in any way. He flicked through his notebook to find the original words as he copied them down. They had stayed the same in his notebook, it seemed, which only cemented the fact that the words in the letter itself were different. That's impossible, Will whispered to himself. As his words echoed in the empty room, the lantern beside him turned on of its own accord, the white burning light blinding him before the lantern settled into a steady flicker. Will flinched away, staring at it with terrified green eyes. The lights. It was always through the lights. In his hotel room and in the London streets, even in the museum, it was the lights. The thing that was in the lights in his mind and in the alleyway, it was here. He could feel it. A cold, unsteady breathing on the back of his neck. "What are you?" Will asked the empty room. Something flickered past the window, casting a dark shadow in the sunset-stained room for just a moment. Perhaps it was a bird flying past outside. Or perhaps, instead, it was something old and formless on this side of the glass. Something without a clear shape, moving too fast to be seen. A breeze ruffled the pages on Will's desk. There was nowhere a breeze could be coming from here, so deep in the library and so far away from any doors or open windows. You're here, aren't you?" Will's tongue felt heavy as he tried to speak. He kept his eyes trained on the ancient text in front of him, too scared to turn around for fear of what he might see. The explorer felt as though he was stuck to his chair, tied down to it and unable to run should something go wrong. Beyond the foreboding and the fear, however, Will felt a deep sense that nothing would go wrong. Everything about the situation should have insisted upon the contrary, and yet still, in a strange way, he felt as if this entity, whatever it was, would not harm him. Not here, at least. Not intentionally. Beneath the layers of heightened fear, Will felt almost calm. There was a whisper in the rustling of the pages on the desk, a groan in the creaking of his chair. Will's attention was drawn back to the notes, and his eyes settled on a word as if guided to it. It seemed familiar as he read it aloud, as if someone had said it to him before, long ago in a dream. Lucinare, Will read. The lamp beside him flickered and grew brighter. He looked up at it, the single contained flame which waved side to side, mimicking the breath of an unseen being. "It's a noun, I think," Will said, unsure now if he could truly say he was speaking to himself. "Is it a name? Is that your name, whatever you are?" The flame grew brighter again, and Will laughed. It was the hollow laugh which follows an unfunny joke, an artificial sound that stretched far beyond disbelief and plummeted into a void of pure, resigned madness. A laugh of acceptance, of faith. There was a whisper in the settling of the building and the crackling of the lantern's flame. Lucinare. Will looked back at the pages, and he could feel his eyes being guided along the words. Perhaps the sensation was new. Or maybe it had been there all along, and the feeling was simply stronger now, as if by speaking the name aloud, Will had strengthened the sway the entity's force had over what he was seeing, the sway it had over him. Or perhaps he was imagining it, and there was nothing different at all. Will couldn't bring himself to believe that. Not after everything he had seen in these last few weeks. The cartographer took out a pencil, and his hand automatically began scribbling into his notebook. Was it him writing? Taking in the language piece by piece? Or was this Lucinare, guiding his hand as he scratched translations into the page, letter by letter, root syllable by root syllable? Did it matter? Did he even care? At this point, Will wasn't sure that he did. He let out a gasp of pain as his hand began to cramp, letting his pencil fall with a clatter. He cradled his hand under the desk, trying to massage it back into life as he read over the notes. "A god," Will read. The handwriting was definitely his own, rather than the scroll of the letter. His memories of making the translation were foggy with lack of sleep, and yet it seemed to him they were undeniably his own. He had translated it. Not this being. Not Lucinare. Him. It says you are a god, Will said aloud to the room. Is that what you are, Lucenare? The lantern grew brighter for an instant, and then flickered until it was almost out. Not a god? Will blinked, and a tear fell from his eyes, which were dry and scratchy from so long staring at the pages. Or not a god anymore. Will felt a pulling in his chest as the light dimmed further, the fading light taking his energy with it. A deep confusion and sadness that belonged to something so much larger than himself slammed into him, threatening to bury him under the emotion. What happened to you, Lucenare? Will gasped, gripping the edges of the desk to ground himself. The light dimmed further and finally flickered out. Will felt that he should be shocked by this, the revelation of gods, if that was truly what these beings were. The entities which existed in these ancient forgotten texts, so far beyond mankind's ideas of existence that it could only be partially portrayed. It felt insane. And yet it was real. Here was one now communicating with him. All of it was real. The idea should have ripped apart his understanding of the reality he had lived in. It should have broken him. And perhaps, in truth, it had. Perhaps Will was already so broken by his time in Lucinare's presence that this was simply mob madness playing into a symphony of insanity. Or perhaps, deep down, Will had accepted a long time ago that the true reality of the universe was far out of his control. Now he merely understood a fraction of the way things were. Will had stared into the face of a god. A weakened, pained god, yes, but a god nonetheless. He had been wounded and he had healed. He had survived where many could not say the same. There was no way he could have deciphered all the texts in front of him. He knew that now. Will was one man trying where dozens had failed. But he had segments. Fragments of rituals and myths, of creatures created by the hands of these entities. He had writings of darkness and of light, and of other worlds beyond them. And of other worlds beyond even that. He saw tales of priests speaking for the beings, speaking for the gods. Humans slowly torn apart from the inside as these creatures nestled in their minds and bodies, controlling their movements and thoughts. Not puppets, exactly. Vessels. There were so many of these beings, more than Will could understand from these texts alone, enough to make his thoughts buckle under the weight of their existence. And then there was Lucenare. Not a name, exactly. Something else. Flame. Or perhaps it was not flame, specifically. Not exactly translated, at least. The word did not convey the warmth of a flame. It did not possess the heat or destruction of fire. It was merely the light. A candle, perhaps, or the rays of the sun. A brightness in the dark. Lucenare was the focus of the text before him. The text he had translated, at least. Other gods and beings were mentioned, of course, but these were his stories. Lucinare's stories. Stories of a god who guided men with his light, as he was now guiding Will. Will held the changed letter beside his notes, and letter by letter walked himself through the translation. He had abandoned trying to translate the older letter in his notebook. The original letter shared few words with what he had deciphered from the ancient text before him. It was easier to focus on the letter itself. The words so important they had changed to deliver themselves to him. When he finished, Will read over what he had written down. He glanced over it again, searching for anything he may have missed. "What does this mean?" he asked into the darkness of the room. I don't understand. The lantern, which for some time now had been empty and unlit, blazed to life with a ball of light so large it pressed against the glass of the lantern, coating it with soot which dimmed the intensity. The letter was important, it seemed. Will knew that. Only he didn't understand why. He didn't understand what the letter meant. The one wrongly taken, Will read aloud in the darkness, his voice weak from fatigue. Lost to those they seek, dies at the hands of a once trusted friend, alone and led astray by the false hope of freedom.